Szanowni Państwo, mam przyjemność otworzyć
It is my pleasure to open today's conference, a time of breakthrough U.S. policy towards transformation in Poland. My name is Nawrocki. I am the head of the Institute of National Remembrance Communications Department, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Banking Center at the former headquarters of the Polish United Workers' Party. It is a great place to discuss Poland's political transformation and to discuss the U.S. perspective on Poland during the political transformation of 1989. I am inviting all those who have not picked up a headset yet to pick one up at the reception. Our speakers will be delivering their papers in their native languages. The conference is being translated, so for your comfort and convenience, please use the interpretation provided. Today's conference is organized by the Historical Research Office of the Institute of National Remembrance with the honorary patronage of the President of the Republic of Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda. It is my pleasure to welcome the organizer of today's event, Dr. Karol Nawrocki, chairman of the Institute of National Remembrance. I would like to also welcome Daniel Lawton, deputy head of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Poland. Also with us is Professor Jim Mazurkiewicz, representing Texas A&M University, on behalf of Mark Welsh. A few words of introduction. I would like to ask Dr. Karol Nawrocki to take the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the nature of the human mind that the more knowledge we have, the more awareness we have, the more we ask questions, and that is true of all of science, not just at the Institute of National Remembrance, but also regarding knowledge of what happened on June 4th, 1989. Today, thanks to research, we know that on the 4th of June, 1989, communism did not come to an end in Poland, but a long and laborious process of transforming the communist state into a democratic one began. The Americans knew this very well in 1989, and when we recall the title of a paper, of an article in the New York Times, published after June 4th, 1989, we will see that the voice of the Poles was a flirtation with pluralism, but also, unfortunately, it proved a flirtation with communism post-1989. That's why I'm very glad that today we are meeting to talk about the impact of the biggest free world power in 1989, the United States, a powerhouse of freedom, the U.S.'s influence on the process of political transformation in Poland and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. That is the topic of this conference. I am very grateful to the organizers. Of course, we provided the institutional patronage. I would like to thank Karol Polejowski, head of the Historical Research Department, Sebastian Pilarski, and a special thanks to Dr. Tomasz Kozłowski, who brought us all together here today. The Institute of National Remembrance is the biggest research academic institution devoted to the 20th century around the world, as evidenced by the 94 kilometers of records we have in our archives, over 2,000 staff, including 300 researchers looking into the history of Poland and the Poles, as well as Poland's relations with other parts of the world. That's why we invite such eminent guests including our American partners.
Chief of Mission of United States of America in Poland, Mr. Lawton, dear Professor Mazurkiewicz, dear scientists from Institute of National Remembrance, and from the United States of America, from Texas, with the great hats. It's a great pleasure, intellectual pleasure for me, and great honor that we can have you here in Warsaw, in Polish capital, on the scientific conference devoted to the attitude of United States of America to the transition process in Poland. I hope, I am even fully convinced that this discussion, thanks to you, will be very fruitful and very interesting. Have a great intellectual time. Thank you very much.
Bardzo dziękuję. Bardzo dziękuję, szanowni państwo, za zabranie głosu.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask Daniel Lawton, Deputy Head of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Poland, to take the floor.
Dzień dobry I serdecznie wszystkich witam.
Good morning and hello to everyone. I am happy that we are here together today.
Let me just say,
Now into English.
Ambassador Brzezinski currently is in the United States, and he sends his warm regards to all of you. Right now, our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, is hosting all ambassadors for an annual conference, and that's why our ambassador is in Washington. But again, he sends his best regards. As you know, his father played a critical role in this transformation, and he is deeply rooted in this process and deeply committed to the U.S.-Poland relationship. It's also an honor for me to be with such distinguished company and to represent the United States Embassy at today's conference. It's really a privilege to serve in this country as we mark 35 years since the renewal of Poland's democracy. And I would like to thank the Institute of National Remembrance for their initiative to organize this conference, and Texas A&M University, home of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, for its strong support. I'm especially delighted to welcome the Texas A&M students with us today. I hope your junior year abroad experience is a remarkable one. I think I'm jealous to be your age again. Doing the junior year abroad is truly an honor and privilege that I hope you will enjoy and make the most of. And I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge Ambassador Simons' presence here today. Ambassador Simons, as a representative of the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Department of State, I want to thank you for your presence, but also for your legacy of service to the United States and for your abiding contribution to the partnership between the United States and Poland. Ambassador, you and many people in this room know the story of Poland's democratic transition far better than I do. But let me share a few words about the historic significance of President George H.W. Bush's visit to Warsaw and Gdansk in July of 1989, just weeks before the Polish people turned out at high noon on the first Sunday in June to render their verdict on communist rule. In rereading President Bush's words from 35 years ago, I'm struck by how relevant they remain today. Speaking just down the street at the Sejm, he declared that Poland's achievement had surpassed all expectation and had earned our admiration. And I could just as easily use the same words today. Poland in 2024 is an anchor of the NATO alliance and the European Union, a key link in the enduring dream of a Europe that is united, whole, and free. And Poland's peaceful democratic transition is a model for other transitioning countries, and the legacy of solidarity continues to inspire democratic activists around the world. But the world does not look at Poland just for what happened 35 years ago. Today, the world looks at Poland and is awed with admiration by the outpouring of support from the Polish people to the people of Ukraine, to the millions of refugees who streamed into Poland following Russia's full-scale further invasion in 2022, and for the support they give to nearly 1 million refugees who remain in Poland today. And standing before the Solidarity Workers' Monument in Gdansk, President Bush encouraged the gathering of workers to follow their dream for a better life for themselves and for their children. It was not a change that would happen overnight. President Bush there in Gdansk acknowledged that economic transition would be difficult, but he assured the workers that they could hope to see a new and prosperous Poland in their lifetime. And indeed, Poland has enjoyed an amazing record of economic growth over the past 30 years. Unemployment is historically low, the country's infrastructure continues to blossom, and Polish young people, the counterparts to the Texas A&M students here today, your counterparts have education and employment opportunities that the Solidarity generation could only dream of. Poland has truly transformed over the course of a single generation. And then President Bush also noted that Poland's challenge was to rise above the legacy of distrust and shattered dreams of the past, as Poles of all political stripes traveled together down the path of negotiation and compromise. So today, I would say this is the challenge that both our countries face, that we as Americans and Poles alike face, that we need to ensure that our citizens benefit from the fruits of democracy. And we need to make our democracies ever stronger in the face of the challenges posed by our adversaries. So today, as you explore the past, let us all dedicate ourselves to applying those lessons to the future. Today we remember, but we also continue to strengthen the enduring, vital partnership between our two great countries. Bardzo dziękuję. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękujemy. Szanowni Państwo, o zabranie głosu poproszę
I would
pana
now like to
profesora
take,
Jima
I would like
Mazurkiewicza,
Professor Jim Mazurkiewicz to take the floor.
University. Bardzo proszę.
From Texas A&M University.
Dzień dobry.
Good morning,
Jak mówi po teksasie, howdy.
or as they say in Texas, howdy.
This is certainly a historic day for all Poles around the world to be proud of. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Daniel Lawton, Deputy Chief Mission, representing our Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, Dr. Karol Nawrocki, President of the Institute of National Remembrance, distinguished guests, and our students from Texas A&M. I want to send out a special thank you to Professor Tomasz Kozłowski for your invitation to provide some opening remarks today at this historic event. This event would not be possible without your leadership and your efforts. We hope our listeners today are inspired and appreciate the accomplishments of those that came before all of us and the shoulders we all stand on today. It is a privilege to represent Texas A&M University and its president, Mark Welsh III, who sends his greetings and congratulations to Poland on celebrating the 35th anniversary of the right to vote in free elections. I'm especially happy to speak on behalf of all of Texas Polonia as president of Texas Polonia. It's also home to the first Polish settlement in the United States, Pana Maria, Texas. It's also the home state of President George H.W. Bush. We want to thank each of you for your attendance here in person and those online celebrating this huge milestone organized by the Institute of National Remembrance. This is a proud moment for me personally. As a fifth-generation Polish Texan American whose ancestors left a partitioned Poland and came to Texas Zalewin. My ancestors were an ethnic group without a recognized country. But they never lost their Polish pride, their heritage, the language, the traditions, and support of our ancestral home, Poland. It's been a long and dangerous journey for Poland since my ancestors immigrated to Texas, but perseverance of the Polish people and their love for freedom has overcome many aggressors and hardships over the past 250 years. We are proud of Poland's accomplishments. The world has a deep respect for Poland due to your leadership, stamina, vision, empathy for your neighbors, as the Chief of Mission said about Ukraine, and not forgetting the past, knowing it will repeat itself if we do nothing. The Solidarity movement and the fall of communism is no doubt one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. Though the June 4th, 1989 parliamentary election was not entirely free, it provided ample opportunity for the people in Poland to demonstrate their total rejection of the system imposed on the country by the Soviet Union. Poland thus achieved what had never been done before, a peaceful transition from a communist totalitarian system to a democracy. And it accomplished this by ballot, not by bullet, and rightly became the role model to be imitated by other societies throughout the region. Today I stand here fully aware of this eventful history to witness the celebration of the 35th anniversary of the right to vote in free elections here in a free Poland. What a privilege, what an honor. I too want to quote President Bush. On July 5th, 1992, as president, here in Warsaw, I quote what the president said in 1992, July the 5th. I've said many times in the deepest sense, the Cold War was a war of ideas, a contest between two different ways of life. The rulers of the old regime claimed that they saw the triumph in the totalitarian ideal written in the laws of history. However, they failed to see the love of freedom written in the human heart here in Poland. He continued, we mark today not simply the memory of a great Polish patriot, Paderewski. We celebrate the men of moral courage who sustained this nation. President Lech Wałęsa, Father Popiełuszko, Pope Jan Paweł II. But Poland could not have come this far and could not have won its freedom if only a few had the courage to stand up against the state. Freedom, actually, was won by the everyday heroes of the underground, the men and women who kept their faith when faith was forbidden, who spoke the truth against a wall of lies. The true heroes of democracy are really the people of Poland. President Bush read the Polish spirit correctly. He saw it and will be remembered for this help to bring this opportunity to Poland. We salute him and honor him as June 12th marks his 100th birthday. Happy birthday, Mr. President, and thank you for your legacy that lives on today in the people at Texas A&M University at the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service. President Bush was a man of vision, a good character, honest values, and integrity. I'm proud to say when Poland joined NATO in March 12, 1999, 25 years ago, is another celebration this year of joining NATO. The U.S. and Poland became a part of the same military alliance. Every Polish government thus far has been a strong supporter of continued American military and economic presence in Europe. And there's no question that today Poland is one of the most dependable allies of the United States. Poland is fast becoming EU's leading military powerhouse and has already allocated 3.9% of its GDP on military spending, more than any other NATO member. In addition, this marks the 20th year anniversary of Poland joining the EU on May 1. I first came to Poland in 2002, 22 years ago, and I personally can see the impact of the European Union here in Poland, the growth, the infrastructure, the investments, and the Polish pride. One of the main benefits is related to a single market with foreign direct investments that has increased significantly every year. The economy has been driven by exchanges and global supply chains, resulting in a 40% increase in Poland's GDP during this time. Today, Poland ranks as the 21st largest economy in the world, and it continues to prosper. Poland's continued determination and endurance to fight for freedom has been documented by history and certainly recognized by the world. The true heroes of Poland are their people and their ideals. There's no doubt Poland has emerged as a leader in Europe, standing for democracy and freedom. The U.S. and Poland have more in common than many people realize. We share hundreds of years of old tradition and devotion to democracy and constitutionalism. We have the two oldest written constitutions in the world, and there's no doubt we are and will continue to be close and strong allies for the values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Poland's belief in freedom, independence, is in your DNA, and I know you will continue to fight for this basic human right. As a representative of General Welsh III, President of Texas A&M University, and President of the Polish-American Council of Texas, representing Texas Polonia, thank you for your warm welcome, and may God bless the free people of Poland. As John Paul II said on October 22, 1978, nie bój się, be not afraid. For those words ignited a movement and led to the freedom and the economic prosperity in Poland as you know it today. Once again, I want to thank everyone for your support and participation. We wish you a successful and wonderful conference. Thank you. God bless Poland, and God bless the United States of America.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie profesorze.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now it's time for the first panel of today's conference under intriguing title, History from the Inside, Personal Perspectives. The first panel will be moderated by the originator of today's conference, Dr. Tomasz Kozłowski. Sir, the floor is yours.
I would like to invite
panelists, Ambassador Thomas Simons, Stefan Kowalec, please join us. Welcome very warmly to the conference. Welcome to panelists, historians, and all the attendants. We have very tight agenda. We will have 3 panels. Panel number 2 and 3 will be strictly academic panels. We will have historians of Polish and American relationships in the 1980s and 90s will present 20-minute papers based on which questions will be based. But this very first panel is unique because it is attended not only by the academics, but who are not outstanding lecturers and specialists in political science and economics, but at the turn of 1990s were in the heart of the events we are discussing today. They have seen from the inside the developments in the White House or at the Ministry of Finance in Poland. So I hope that this combination of specialist scientific academic knowledge with personal experiences will give us a very unique perspective, which will be a great introduction for the following panels. So once again, I want to present Ambassador Thomas Simons, a professional diplomat who in the years 1986-1989 was Deputy Assistant of the Secretary of State, and in the years 1990-93 Ambassador of the US to Poland. He is an academic who is related to Harvard and Kennan's Institute. I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Hutchings, who in the turn of the 1980s acted as Deputy Director of Free Europe Radio in Munich. In the years 1989-92, he was the Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. Our next panel, he was also a lecturer at Princeton University of Texas and Woodrow Wilson International Center. The Polish perspective of an economist will be presented by Stefan Kawalic, who in 1989 was appointed General Director at the Ministry of Finance. In the years 1991-94 was Deputy Minister of Finance, and at this time he offered the program of economic reforms implemented in Poland after he left the public service. He worked in the banking sector. I'm very pleased to welcome you, gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to moderate this panel. I'm very happy that you have decided to attend. So this is a very unique panel. This is why we'll start with on a personal note. The first question to Ambassador Simons. You were the ambassador at the time of political transformation, but it was not your first mission in Poland. So how have you arrived to Poland? How it has come to that you have landed in Poland, and what relationship did you have in the 1980s and 90s? As a deputy assistant to the Secretary of State, because many activists of solidarity have spoken very warmly of you, because both you and American diplomacy have strongly supported solidarity. But once I've read a description of you by Polish intelligence officer. He has written that Mr. Simons is very intelligent and very dangerous, but he authentically likes our country. So when an intelligence officer says something about a person with whom he fights, it must be true.
My connection with Poland goes back to Calcutta, British India, in 1946. I was 7 years old. My father was a diplomat serving there. And I was taken to a movie about the destruction of Warsaw in 1939, a black and white movie with the Stukas dropping their bombs straight into the city. And it was scary, but it impressed me with the tragedy of Polish history. And that was one of the things that connected me with Poland from then on. So I understand why there's a museum for the Westerplatte battle in Gdańsk. But I think also that, as we've heard this morning, that Poland has moved beyond Westerplatte and Samosiera into a new political age. To me, the miracle of the 1980s and 1990s was moving to a politics of dialogue and compromise, leaving behind the history of bloody failures, heroic but bloody failures. So I served here, I served in Washington, I served here in Warsaw from 1968 to 1971. Very hard years. I arrived after March, but within a week, Poland had joined the invasion of Czechoslovakia next door. And relations sank to a very low level between the United States and Poland. But they continued because they had a very strong basis in history. I'm wearing a button here celebrating the 100th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1919. And I spent a year in the consular section talking to ordinary Poles, most of them from Galicia, going to Chicago. And you learn a lot that way, even though relations were not very active. Then in the 1980s, I served in Washington in the positions that Tomasz describes. And we had a pretty active program of relations with Poland, starting at the low point. Well, actually, I came on as director for Soviet affairs, not directly involved with Poland, in 1981. And so lived through martial law, the low point, and then the very slow climb through the 1980s, actually sparked by President Bush. His personal interest in Poland went back. It was 1983 that he gave the speech in Vienna, which announced the objective of a Europe whole and free. So he had an interest in an administration which admittedly was concentrated on policy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But within that policy, Poland, as the largest of the Soviet Union's allies and the most vulnerable to change, was the most important country for us. So I think we'll talk about that a little later, but that's my background and how I came. As I said, when the microphone was not on, the ube was not always wrong. I do have a lot of affection for Poland.
Teraz podobne pytanie kieruję do Roberta Hutchinsa, bo kiedy
And now, a similar question to
przełomowe momenty w historii Polski, zarówno Narodziny Solidarności w
to Robert Hutchings, when he worked for Radio Free Europe, you saw similar events. You saw the martial law introduced in 1982. When you worked at the White House in the late 80s and early 90s, you were responsible for Central and Eastern Europe, and especially for Poland. But I think there's also a personal thread, a thread of sympathy, because you even named your dog after a Polish king. So there seems to be a highly personal connection and a lot of sympathy for Poland's history and culture.
On this panel, a great pleasure to be on a panel with Tom Simons again. We haven't seen each other for quite a while. It's great to be reunited. Let me start with the dog. He was a German Shepherd, extremely brave, courageous, loyal, very good looking, so I immediately thought of Poland, of course, and named him Casimir III, wonderful dog. Unlike Tom, my association with Eastern Europe started rather late. In my second year of graduate school, I took a course taught by a Polish emigre named Jan de Weidenthal, and I had planned to be a Latin Americanist, but I just became fascinated by the region, by the drama here, and for all the wrong reasons, I suppose, but maybe one right reason, I switched my focus to Central and Eastern Europe. The wrong reasons were I have no Slavic blood whatsoever, didn't speak a word of any Slavic languages, so it made no sense to switch gear in my second year of graduate school. But the right reason was I just became fascinated, passionately fascinated with the region, and I decided to follow my passions for as long as they lasted, and it turned out they lasted a very long time. This may be a message for you students down there to follow your passions. It will make sense in the longer run. So after I got the PhD, I was planning to be an academic. I had a couple of teaching offers, almost accepted one, when I got approached almost by accident to become deputy director of Radio Free Europe. I was at that time 32 years old, so it was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up and didn't pass up. So my family and I moved to Munich. I was deputy director there for 5 years. And of course, within a year after arriving, the events of mid-August 1980 in Gdańsk unfolded. I remember this as if it were yesterday, being in the building almost the entire long weekend as strikes spread to the coastal area, and then a group called the Inter-Factory Strike Committee was established. We later learned from Lech Wałęsa that he was aware that strikes had spread to the coastal area only by listening to Radio Free Europe. That was his source of news. So it was on the basis of that information that he created the Interfactory Strike Committee, which soon became Solidarność. So for 1980 and 1981, I lived and breathed Poland. Every waking day, we followed the drama. We tried, with the means at our disposal, which was the spoken word over the radios, of trying to provide objective commentary and balanced analysis to help the process along. Then the next dramatic event was December 13th, 1981. I was at home, got called about 5 in the morning, saying General Jaruzelski has announced that he will address the nation at 6 a.m. So I hurried into the office, had a quick meeting with the directors of the Polish Broadcasting Service, and they went on the air right after Jaruzelski announced the imposition of martial law. There was kind of a speculation leading up to that point that Jaruzelski might simultaneously abolish the Communist Party and start anew. That, of course, did not happen. Martial law was declared. Interestingly, the broadcast leaders of the Polish service, 4 of them, did a panel discussion which wound up being perhaps the mildest, softest commentary ever broadcast by Radio Free Europe, because, like Jan Nowak Jagiellonowski many years before, they feared a bloodbath in Poland if there was a heroic and ultimately futile armed resistance. So they decided to go soft. I spoke with those leaders after the broadcast and said, we can't be that soft. So they toughened up the message in the next broadcast. But I remember thinking at that time that communist rule in Poland is finished. It may have a decade. That's what I said. Well, it turned out that barely made that decade, and we'll get to the events at the end of the 1980s in a few minutes.
To teraz podobne pytanie.
So now a similar personal question to Mr. Stefan Kawalec, because in 1983 you were at the main school for planning and statistics,
Nawiązuje pan bliższą współpracę chyba wtedy z Leszkiem
and you established closer cooperation
na tej samej uczelni.
with Leszek Balcerowicz, who was also at the same university.
Pańska współpraca z nim w Ministerstwie Finansów.
And then you worked with the Ministry of Finance as Director General, and that was quite clear. But you reached 1983 via quite a strange road. In the latter half of the 1980s, you are a collaborator, you are supporting the Worker Protection Committee, you're engaged in building the Solidarity movement. You were arrested during martial law. It's not a typical path of an economist.
Dzień dobry Państwu. Bardzo dziękuję
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this conference and to be on this panel. I am thrilled to be part of a panel with such eminent individuals. It is a pleasure to meet Mr. Robert Hutchings, whom I never met before, so I would like to use this opportunity to express my gratitude to you for that incredible act of American assistance to Poland, which lasted several years. This was Radio Free Europe, which had tremendous significance for Poland since its founding until the moment when Poland regained its independence, as it were. So it is quite a personal pleasure to meet you after 30 years, and also to meet Tomasz Simons, with whom I was in touch when I was at the Ministry of Finance, and Tomasz was U.S. ambassador to Poland. So like Tomasz Kozłowski said, in the 1970s I was involved in the democratic opposition movement. I was involved in the core committee and in Solidarity. I studied mathematics at the University of Warsaw, and I got interested in economics because it was my belief that the democratic opposition, which dreamed of a free and democratic Poland, that they should be able to propose something when it came to the economy. So I had no formal background in economics because I had never studied economics, given the programs, the university programs in that field in communist Poland, and I had no such intention. I did do my own economic work, reading Western manuals and Western textbooks, as well as various Polish sources. But the fact that economics, as a result, became my main field, became my career, that was because of my meeting with two individuals. The first of these individuals was Professor Janusz Beksiak, who was a renowned economist in the 1970s. His leaving of the Communist Party and of Gierek's advisory group made waves. And during the Solidarity Carnival, Professor Beksiak set up a team of economists that advised Solidarity. And I was on that team as an observer on behalf of the Mazovia region, the Solidarity Mazovia region. And that meeting was important. Later on, after martial law, first I was arrested, then I was in hiding for many months, and eventually in 1983 I contacted Professor Beksiak again, at which point he proposed that I take part in some of his field research. This field research consisted of interviews with people who were company heads, members of the economic administration, of local authorities, banks, as well as private companies, craftsmen, as well as the founders of new Polish or Polonia companies. So I took part in this field research. I conducted interviews, but I also analyzed the materials collected by the whole team. So how were the interviews organized? We asked our interlocutors to describe specific cases that they had come across in their economic activity. These were fascinating conversations, and it gave me very interesting insights into what was actually happening within Poland's socialist economy, which was essentially in crisis in the 80s. Later on, quite quickly, in 1983, Professor Beksiak said that he had spoken to the chairman of the main School of Planning and Statistics. This was at the time the largest school of economics in Poland. Today it is the Warsaw School of Economics. And he arranged for me to be employed at that university as long as I refrained from contacts with the students, that I would have no lectures. However, I would be able to work there as a researcher. So once I started work at that university, I got in touch with Leszek Balcerowicz, whom I knew from the Beksiak team. So Balcerowicz invited me to his semi-private seminar, and from that time onwards, for 6 years, we met once a week to analyze different economic systems around the world and trying to come up with the reforms for Poland.
Teraz chciałbym już przejść do tej części
Now I would like to move on
bardziej
to
dotyczącej tej wielkiej historii.
sort of history with a capital H, a more general outlook, while maintaining your unique personal perspectives. And right now I would like to ask Ambassador Simons, could you describe the role that Poland played in American policy in the 1980s? Of course, this is a very broad subject, because what we have here essentially is a transition from Jaruzelski, who was the black sheep of the whole Eastern Bloc because he introduced martial law and he delegalized, outlawed solidarity. However, this system evolved, and it seems that by the end of the 1980s, Poland and Hungary had become countries that were most eagerly pursuing reforms and also seemed to be conducive to Western pressures to reform. So, in reference to George Bush and his participation in these processes, could you say something? Because back in 1987, George Bush as vice president, he had a very important visit to Poland. I remember that you took part in a meeting with Deputy President Bush and his colleague, who was secretary, who was treasurer, Mr. Baker, at which the issue of what Bush is to say to the Poles and Jaruzelski was discussed during his visit in Poland.
The 1980s were a long, hard slog in U.S. policy toward Eastern Europe. The center of U.S. policy was, and I think had to be, the Soviet Union. And but President Bush, Vice President Bush, took a personal interest in Eastern Europe, going back to at least to that 1983 speech in Vienna that I mentioned before. So you start at the bottom with martial law, December 1981, and you go from there to a special session of NATO in Brussels in January of 1982, where the alliance had to struggle and come up with a policy toward Poland under martial law. And it was a struggle between the Americans who wanted unconditional sanctions on both Poland and the Soviet Union, and our European allies who were afraid of losing all the hard-won achievements of Dayton in the 1970s, and who therefore insisted that sanctions be conditional. In other words, that they could be reversed if Poland met three conditions. The first would be lifting martial law. The second would be releasing all political prisoners. And the third would be a renewal of dialogue with the church and solidarity. And that was the agreed NATO position. And that remained the framework of Western policy and of US policy through the 1980s. And at every stage, when Poland met one of the conditions, it provoked a struggle within the US government over how to respond. The first time was when Poland lifted martial law in 1983, although the legal framework for oppression remained in place, but it did meet one of the NATO conditions. And we didn't change policy at that point. The real next test came in just as I came into my new job with responsibility for Poland in the summer of 1986, was the release of all political prisoners in September of 1986. That forced us into an internal struggle over how to respond. And meanwhile, we had discovered a champion for Eastern Europe within the U.S. government. The number 2 man in the State Department, John Whitehead, the Deputy Secretary of State, had asked for and received from Secretary Schultz a mandate to pay special attention to Eastern Europe. So when we came up to the question of how to respond to the release of political prisoners, which was the second of the NATO conditions, the struggle was what to say about whether there would be an economic benefit to Poland, which was in an economic crisis at that point, as it had been for 10 years, what to say to the Poles if political liberalization continued, there would be an economic benefit. But the immediate task was whether to lift our sanctions on Poland. And Whitehead led the struggle within the U.S. government against opposition from Treasury and from many offices within the government who simply didn't want to do anything for a communist country with such a bad record in politics and human rights. But he won, and President Reagan then, in February of 1987, lifted our sanctions on Poland. The next step was when Vice President Bush announced that he wanted to visit Poland in September of that year. And that provoked another struggle over what he should say to General Jaruzelski about if Poland continued political liberalization, would there be an economic response from the United States? And you had the same lineup within the U.S. government, Treasury against, and various offices throughout the government. I remember sitting next to the Vice President in the payoff meeting with his friend of 30 years, James Baker, who was Secretary of the Treasury. And Treasury was opposed to promising any economic benefit because they considered the Polish economy in such bad shape that any U.S. money that went to Poland would be wasted. So it would be a waste of taxpayers' money. Bush overruled him. And so when we came to Warsaw in 1987, he told Jaruzelski that if political liberalization continued, there would be an economic payoff. He also told him that we would help with Poland's overpowering hard currency debt, which had climbed from 700 million to some 19 billion by that point in 1987. So that was the second step. And the third step, of course, came in 1989 with the new Bush administration, and Bob can elaborate on this, but we had reviews of policy toward the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. I chaired both those reviews. They gathered all the U.S. agencies involved with these. Most of it was non-controversial because we had the feeling that the administration didn't want product, they wanted delay. Well, they figured out what they wanted to do with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But the one controversy was over Poland, because the roundtable was underway from February of '89, and it looked as if it was going to end with the first genuine power sharing in Eastern Europe since the 1940s. So the question was how the U.S. would respond. And you had the same lineup, Treasury against, other agencies of the U.S. government against, but a new administration in the White House. So I went to the White House to say, and got out the memorandum of conversation from 1987, where Bush had told Jaruzelski that if liberalization continued, there would be a payoff. And I gave this to the people in the working group, and I said, and I asked the White House, the new White House, permission to say, the president wants this. And they said, go ahead, tell him. And we also, a colleague of mine secretly took a draft of a speech for Bush to give in response over to the White House without telling me. And we told the group that this is what the president wants. They assented, and the White House also used that draft for the speech Bush gave in Hamtramck, which is a Polish-American enclave in the city of Detroit, promising economic benefit. At the time, it was very small. It was peanuts. But the principle, once again, for the third time in that decade, was achieved. And Polish, with the announcement of Polish economic reform, with, I think, Balcerowicz's visit to Washington, which was very impressive. By the end of the year, by the end of 1989, American commitment to economic benefit for Poland had risen to $2 billion. And that was the 1980s in U.S. policy.
Teraz chciałem się skierować pytanie do Roberta Hutchinsa.
Now the question to Robert Hutchinson. In 1989, you were at the White House together. You came to the White House together with Bush administration, and anyone in your place would have wished such a great start for your work. We have round table talks in Poland, which pave the way to partially free elections. What are your recollections of that time? How did you view the situation in Poland? Was it surprising for you, or was it something that you expected?
Well, thank you very much. Let me pick up where Ambassador Simons left off. I also participated in those policy reviews, which didn't achieve much. They were all of government reviews. They served a certain purpose, but they didn't come up with anything very dramatic. Meanwhile, we had in a much smaller group a serious policy discussion at the National Security Council, and we were seized by two events. One was Gorbachev's December 1988 speech at the United Nations, when he declared Soviet intention of withdrawing 500,000 Soviet forces from the western military districts of the USSR and Eastern Europe. Now, this was just a promise, not yet a reality, but it was the most significant statement by a Soviet leader in a very long time. The other event, of course, was the Roundtable Agreement in Poland, which we are following with great anticipation. Our judgment at that time ran like this, and it was almost exactly the words we used. If the terms of the Roundtable Agreement are faithfully executed and open elections are held in Poland in the summer of 1989, this is the beginning of the end of communism in Poland. If that's the case, this is the beginning of the end of communism everywhere in Eastern Europe, including East Germany, which means the German question just leaped onto the international agenda. This was months before the opening of the Berlin Wall. Now, we weren't predicting these events, but we were seeing the logic of what could transpire, and it's why the results of the Roundtable Agreement became so critical in our thinking, that if the terms of this agreement are honored, this is the end of the Cold War. Now, we weren't thinking about months, we were thinking about years, but that's why it was considered so important. So I was dispatched to Warsaw and Gdańsk and Budapest in May of 1989 to prepare the way for the president's visit, which came in July. I remember vividly a meeting with Bronisław Geremek at the ambassador's residence, exactly where I had met with him a year before at the time of the so-called anti-crisis pact. Geremek's message to us was, we don't want you to support us because that would only provoke a reaction. We want you to support a process. That means we want you to work with the regime of Jaruzelski as well as Solidarity to encourage a process leading to this outcome. Interestingly, on the trip, I had with me a paper written by János Kiss, the dissident philosopher in Budapest, who was saying essentially the same things. The task of the United States is not to support the opposition, it's to support a process and work with the regime as well as the opposition to bring about an outcome. So our choices at that point were, we saw how much potential there was. The question was, what do we do about it? Well, the pressure from the outside the administration, including from Henry Kissinger, was the United States needs to seek a strategic understanding with Moscow. Too much is at stake to allow these unpredictable events to unfold. We thought this was a very bad idea, and we chose another path, that is to throw U.S. weight entirely behind the process of democratic change in Eastern Europe, meaning Poland and Hungary. So it was a choice, and I think we made the right choice, and Kissinger, smart as he was wrong on this point. I'll just say one more word, that I'd thought a lot about this because I had written a book. My first book was called Soviet-East European Relations, and I had just written a preface to the paperback edition of that book a year before called Gorbachev and Eastern Europe. So I thought about how can the United States help position itself to make a breakthrough more likely? We can't cause these events, but how can we use our influence to precipitate a breakthrough? I'll leave it at that because...
Can I just add one thing? We also were against that Kissinger proposal. I have a file in my files which is entitled Yalta II. And I was the author of a memo to Secretary Baker, which ended up, why buy what you're going to get for free?
Yes, for those who don't know, we might add that Henry Kissinger presented his plan, dubbed Yalta II, in the hallways of the Department of State. He presented it to Gorbachev in January 1989 on a visit to Moscow, where he was essentially a personal envoy from President Bush. However, it turned out later on that both the White House and the Department of State had unilaterally opposed this proposal, recognizing it as unfavorable both to Eastern Europe but also to the U.S. So right now, I would like to shift our focus a little because we have been focusing on the grand scheme of things, and right now we might go to economy, the grand scheme of things in economic terms, because it really sheds light on what happened in 1989 as well. And I would like you to touch on two themes. Firstly, what condition was the Polish economy in at the end of the 1980s? Because one important factor determining Poland's position in the world, especially its position vis-à-vis the West, was that it had a debt of $40 billion. That is one issue, and the other issue is, were economists in your surroundings at the Central School of Statistics and Planning, economists like Professor Beksiak, did you determine that this top-down economic system had essentially run its course, that it was at an end and there was no way of keeping it? And did you start to look for inspiration in the West? And was that a general trend? So did economists simply stop speaking the language of Marx and Lenin and start speaking the language of Thatcher and Reagan? Because you seem to have been a pioneer of privatization. In 1988, you wrote an outline of a plan to privatize the Polish economy. So, when it comes to the condition of the Polish economy in the 1980s, that was a time of crisis. The economy was in a slump. Gierek had given some impetus to the Polish economy in the early 80s based on international loans, which were then to be repaid as Poland had more exports, but the exports never came, and the loans, the debt was there to stay. So in the 80s, Poland was not repaying its international loans, not repaying its debts to other governments. It's only paying sort of symbolic interest on these loans to private banks. But Poland certainly isn't getting any new money. Imports are limited, the economy is stifled, the economy is stagnant. On the one hand, there are attempts to reform the economic system, but the top-down distribution system is still maintained. So, as there is a growing awareness of the failure of the centrally planned economy, this awareness is quite common among critical economists, those who were still had their critical thinking in place. So people were beginning to think of reforms, of introducing a market-based system to some degree. At the same time, however, most economists, almost everyone, assumed that such changes have to be introduced in such a way as not to undermine the official premises or assumptions of the socialist economy. You quoted a statement by Bush in 1987, I think, at a meeting with Mazowiecki, when Bush said that we had hopes with regard to Poland. However, we never foresaw what eventually happened, even though we had intelligence, we had analysts, but nobody had foreseen what happened in 1989. And similarly, Polish economists did not foresee what eventually happened, and they did not believe that Poland would one day see the introduction of the Western market-based capitalist system in the full sense of the term. And in 1988, I co-organized a conference which had been organized partly at the initiative of Solidarity and the main School of Planning and Statistics. And we invited leading economists who were independent thinkers, and we asked them what would they propose if there were no political restrictions. So if there were no limits, what would they propose if Poles could decide what sort of economic system they'd like to have? And some of the speakers at this conference were not able to step out of the box. And so there were essentially only two papers that proposed radical property reforms. sort of moving towards private property and a capitalist economy in Poland. One of these papers was presented by Janusz Lewandowski and Jan Schomburg from Gdańsk, and they proposed a quick revolution, essentially consisting in turning state-owned companies into shareholder companies, and to sell these shares, to sell these companies. Only they said not to do it for money, but in exchange for special vouchers that would be handed out to all citizens in equal quantities. So this idea then became quite well known, and it was applied first in Czechoslovakia in 1991. It was known as coupon privatization. So this voucher privatization was then applied in most former socialist countries, in the former Soviet zone and in Yugoslavia. However, there are two paradoxes associated with this idea, which were very hard to foresee in 1988. The first paradox is that this idea concocted and proposed in Poland was never ultimately used in Poland. It was only applied marginally after several years with regard to a very small part of the national property. So that is one paradox. And the other paradox is that the results, the outcomes of that privatization were not as intended. It produced the opposite effect. So where did the idea stem from originally? Well, it stemmed from the idea that if we want to sell national property quickly, and people have no money, there's no private capital, so in order to sell it fast, those who have a bit more money, either because they had connections in the previous system or they got the money illegally, they would be able to seize control over most state-owned property for almost nothing. So the idea was to give everybody vouchers to equalize their chances of obtaining national property. However, the reality was that when the system was employed, most people had no idea what shares were. No, they had no idea how it worked. And so those who had a bit more money, they were able to purchase things for a very low cost. They purchased these vouchers, which led to these large empires arising in Russia and Ukraine and Czechoslovakia through coupon privatization, so that it had the opposite effect to what its originators intended. But here I ventured into the future. However, in '88, at the said conference, I presented a program to transform the Polish economy into an open market economy with private property through the liberalization of prices and privatization, which I dubbed top-down privatization and bottom-up privatization. By bottom-up privatization, I understood removing any restrictions on the creation and development of private companies, whereas by top-down privatization, I understood the sale of state-owned companies using techniques that had been used in the mass privatizations of the 80s in Great Britain and in France. At the same time, in my paper, I also reflected on the question, what sort of guarantees do we have that introducing a free market and privatization is going to be a good response to the problems of the Polish economy. Why would it bring prosperity to Poland? After all, there are many countries that have a capitalist economy and they're not doing that well. And one of the examples that I drew upon at the conference was interwar Poland. And so, counter to the early belief that Poland was doomed to fail economically, that we stood no chances of economic success, I argued that Poland had potentially great economic advantages that could be used if an open market system was introduced. So these advantages that might help Poland develop very fast. And one of these advantages was Poland's location right next to the rich countries of Western Europe, and also its low wages. So I argued that if Poland was to introduce a market economy system, Poland would become a very attractive area to invest in. At the same time, I argued that there were obvious problems with infrastructure. There was no business infrastructure, no roads, telecommunications, banks, hotels, and that was going to be an obstacle. However, I also argued that this infrastructure would quickly be built because it would be very profitable to invest in. At the same time, analyzing the experience of interwar Poland, I presented data showing that Poland's economic failures during the interwar period. And what were those failures about? Well, interwar Poland was not able to surpass pre-World War I industrial production levels. So those failures mostly stemmed from the fact that interwar Poland was cut off from its traditional markets because there were no economic relations with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, there was a customs war with Germany. So Polish exports to those markets were greatly reduced compared to the situation before World War I. And hence I used that argument in support of the claim that our economic transformation, in order for it to be profitable, Poland needs guaranteed access to Western European markets. And hence, being part of the European community was a condition for Poland to attain economic prosperity. At the same time, I argued that Poland was going to have a very serious economic difficulties to attain that. So this was received with quite a lot of interest and with sympathy. However, most people saw this as science fiction. It was November 1988, before the round table talks. Nonetheless, a year passed, and certain elements of that program became the foundation of Mazowiecki's economic program.
I have a recommendation and a short comment. The recommendation is, if you're interested in Poland's economic situation in the 80s, I recommend to you the book published in 2022 by our colleague Fritz Bartel, which puts the Polish economic situation in a broader economic and ideological framework, and I think really gives you a sense of how deep the crisis was and how radical the steps were needed and taken to deal with it. From my point of view as ambassador, during this period when the program was going into shape, I was always skeptical that there could be broad-scale privatization of the large firms, which were monopolies in their branches, but they held the infantry of the Solidarity movement. And I didn't think the Solidarity workers were going to permit mass privatization on the Russian model. So every once in a while I would get an instruction from Washington to go in and pound the table for privatization. And I would go to the Minister of Privatization and I would sit there and say, "You have to do more." And he would say, "Yes, we have to do more." And then I would leave and nothing would happen. And I would come back a couple months later with the same instruction. But meanwhile, the program had the same effect, mainly by opening entry for new firms. So Poland, within a year, had 1.5 million new firms, which could take off the workers who were losing their jobs in the big firms, and Poland opened its frontiers to Western goods, which forced those big monopoly firms to act like firms, and it reformed the price structure too. You got real pricing. And so you were doing things short of mass privatization, which were forcing the economy in the direction of the market without privatization. You thought you were doing privatization, though. I don't know if you did or not.
Panie ambasadorze, to może jeszcze jedno
Ambassador,
pytanie,
one more
bo
question to
w
you.
1989 roku
In
jest pan w
1989,
Departamencie
you were
Stanu
at
do
the
czerwca,
State Department,
do
working
czerwca.
until State Department
Till
until
the-
June.
June 1989 you're in the State Department, right?
Więc do czerwca pan pracował w
Następnie
Departamencie
prowadzi pan
Stanu.
wykłady i
And
pisze
next you were a
książkę i później
lecturer
wraca
and
dopiero
you
na
wrote a book
stanowisko
and then
ambasadora w 1990
you
roku.
returned as ambassador in 1989, and my question is, we are talking about big politics. We are trying, we are referring to President of the U.S. Washington White House, to U.S. Polish policy, but could you present us a certain background to American policy? Because the U.S. policy is public opinion, Polish diaspora in the U.S. In 1998, what was the outlook? What was the approach to Poland? Because I believe it was great enthusiasm and interest in what was going on in Poland, which translated into the fact that the congressmen and the public opinion pressed the White House to conduct more active policy towards Poland. So to be more active, maybe propose a larger financial support. How did you see this part outside the White House?
It was very much a structure and a political situation which gave the executive branch the primacy in terms of making policy. Not just the White House, but also the State Department. The Treasury was very important. But public opinion and the Congress had a much more limited role. The Polish minority in the United States, I think 1980, 9 million people declared themselves of Polish descent in the census. But historically, it has really lacked a lot of political weight. It's dispersed. It's concentrated in a few places. The Polish-American Congress, in my time, the executive branch cared about it, but I think mainly in terms of electoral politics. I think President Bush, as part of a Republican program to win over so-called white ethnics who had traditionally voted Democratic, was anxious to attract the Polish-American vote, and that was one of the reasons why he wanted to go to Poland in September of 1987, just before the cutoff came, which prevented public funding for campaign purposes. So there was an element, and Jan Nowak-Jeziorynski, as the major lobbyist for the Polish-American Congress, had extraordinary individual political weight. And he and I worked closely through this whole period. I mean, he continued to be a political figure, and that continued especially under the Olszewski government in 1992. But other than that, there was not. I think that defines the role of public opinion and the Polish-American minority in these issues. It was very much an executive branch operation.
You have mentioned Jan Nowak-Jeziorański. Was Zbigniew Brzeziński an advocate for Poland at that time?
He was on the phone all the time. I had to remind people that I was the American ambassador, and there was some sentiment in Poland for making him president of Poland, but so he had a role, and it was a positive role. I didn't much interfere in what he was doing. I had a self-limitation rule for myself that I did not advocate with the Polish government for individual members of the government. I didn't think, except for the foreign minister. When you had a change of government, I would advocate for retaining Krzysztof Skubiszewski as foreign minister. But I think probably Zbig was much more forceful in naming people that, in giving advice on personnel to the Polish government, and I'm sure that included Leszek Balcerowicz during the changes.
I wanted to ask Robert Hutchings, because we have discussed the June elections during your previous statement, and the June elections have proven a great success of solidarity, and a month later in Warsaw, George Bush arrives to Poland and presents his support for the democratization of Poland. You have been preparing this visit, and when you are reading the memoirs, so the visit of President Bush came about at the time of presidential crisis, because as a result of the negotiation of the Round Table and Magdalenka Agreement, it was assumed that General Jaruzelski would be elected a president, but the result of the elections have questions these agreements. And in his memoirs, George Bush wrote, it seemed ironic that American president wants to force or to advise a communist president to run for the elections in Poland, because during the talks he encouraged Jaruzelski to run for president. What was the reason for it? Was it because the White House wanted to support evolutionary changes in Poland? Did you think that there would be chaos in Poland or reaction on the part of the Soviet Union if Jaruzelski wasn't a president? So after the Tadeusz Mazowiecki government was appointed, people were euphoric because we have had the first non-communist prime minister. But was there a time that you have wondered that the things went too far, that a red line has been crossed, the red line painted by the Soviets?
Oh, the short answer is no, but the longer answer is run something like this. It was a very delicate time in Poland. The Roundtable Agreement wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the process that was full of opportunity, but also full of risk. That's the way we saw it. That's the way Bronisław Geremek saw it. That's the way Tadeusz Mazowiecki saw it, Adam Michnik. Most of the other people we were in touch with through the embassy saw the same thing, that we were trying to maneuver through this period that would result in the happy outcome that we got with the election of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, which to me was the most important event of that year, leading up to the breach of the Berlin Wall. Let me back up a little bit. When I went to Poland, to Warsaw and Gdańsk, to advance the president's trip in May, one of our requirements, what we were trying to do was make sure the regime would honor its commitments to hold free elections. So I said that we wanted President Bush, during his visit in the summer, to address the first freely elected Polish parliament, the same in 40 years. Well, the reaction from the regime counterparts was of alarm. They didn't know whether the Roundtable Agreement was going to be honored. They didn't know what the election was going to bring about. They didn't know whether the election results would be honored if Solidarity won, so it was all up in the air. But we wanted to use this visit to make sure that they knew that the visit was off. If there was no freely elected Sejm, Bush wasn't coming. So that was our condition. And it was a small thing, maybe not so small. It was what we could do to advance the prospect of the elections being held as scheduled. Now, when we came to Jaruzelski, we were conscious of not just the expectations of the Roundtable Agreement, the agreement itself specified that no matter the results of the election, Jaruzelski would remain president, and the Polish Communist Party would retain the Defense, Interior, and Transportation ministries. Now, you can debate whether that was a wise thing or not, but those are the terms of the Roundtable Agreement, and we thought, as did the relevant advisors around Wałęsa, that to violate the terms of that agreement that early risked throwing the whole thing away, risked the whole thing coming undone. So it wasn't our preference that Jaruzelski remain president. It was following the advice that we were getting from the relevant figures around Wałęsa that this is what was needed to keep this process on track. So we didn't, there's been an argument that somehow President Bush preferred Jaruzelski to Wałęsa. I mean, this is just, it's so nonsensical, I hardly want to even address it. Why would he have even visited Poland if he wanted Jaruzelski to remain president? Why didn't he go to Moscow instead and just bypass Poland altogether? The whole point of the visit was to advance the prospect of democratic change in Poland. When Mazowiecki was elected, we were elated. It was, and not only his election, but he was the right man at the right time. His somber, hangdog face was the perfect temperament to have at that time. He declared that we draw a thick line with the past, that is, we're moving to a new era, but we also intend to honor the obligations of the Warsaw Pact. It was precisely the right conciliatory message to send to Moscow. Of course, things unraveled very quickly, as I think he understood they would, but had he and his administration not acted so skillfully in those early days, the whole process that we think of in 1989 might have come unraveled. So that's the way we saw it. But for me, it was when Mazowiecki's government was installed that I realized that the Cold War is coming to an end. This is the defining event for me.
No, istotnym elementem nowego rządu.
An important element of a new government created by Tadeusz Mazowiecki was the question of a Minister of Finance. And not many people know that it is thanks to you that Leszek Balcerowicz was appointed the Minister of Finance. He wasn't aware that Mazowiecki saw him for this position. He was about to go for a foreign scholarship, and if not a coincidental meeting with you, he wouldn't have learned about this proposal, and he would go abroad to teach.
Balcerowicz
was presented the offer, he accepted. You were one of his closest co-workers, so Poland was heavily indebted in the West, and at the same time it tries to restructure the loans, to obtain new loans. And in any capital they visit or they hold talks, be it Washington, Paris, London, Bonn, everyone says, we can talk about restructuring your loans or new loans, provided that you introduced reforms consistent with the recommendations of International Monetary Fund. And the question to you, how many your solutions were included in this program, and how much did you have to compromise and obey with the recommendations by IMF?
So, when Balcerowicz became Minister of Finance, what happened was that in August 1989, I was visited by Waldemar Kuczyński, who told me that it had already been agreed that Mazowiecki would be Prime Minister and that he is advising Mazowiecki, and one of his tasks is to put together an economic team. The Polish economy was in dire straits at this time. The socialist economy was falling apart, plus there was hyperinflation, which erupted when the final communist government liberalized food prices on August 1st. At this time, 30% of the budget was financed by printing money and through a loan from the National Bank of Poland. And all of that together led to hyperinflation, which was 50% by August. It had risen to 50% over a month. If it stayed at that pace, it would have been 10,000% up. So Kuczyński said he was looking for people who had some ideas for what to do with the economy. So I told him to contact Balcerowicz and do it fast, because Balcerowicz is about to go abroad to teach economics at some British university. So shortly after my meeting with Kuczyński, after 2 or 3 days, I get a call from Balcerowicz asking whether I could lend him a wheel for a small Fiat car, a Fiat 126P, known as the Little Fiat. This was a car produced in Poland on a Fiat license, and it was the most popular car at the time. It was quite tiny, and his wheel had been stolen. It was hard to get car parts. So this emergency wheel had been stolen, and the spare wheel had been stolen, and he was driving without it, and he went to visit family. He was going to visit family in Toruń. However, he was afraid to embark on this long road trip without a spare wheel. So he knew I had a small Fiat, and he asked me to lend him a spare. And he said they'd go in 2 cars with his wife. They would leave the little Fiat in Toruń, and they would take the spare wheel back and return in the second car. And he would return the wheel. So when Balcerowicz came to my place to pick up the spare wheel, I asked him whether he had spoken to Kuczynski, and he said Kuczynski had left him a message, had recorded a message. However, Balcerowicz thought that this was another journalist who wanted to talk to him about the condition of the Polish economy, and he decided that since this was on the eve of his departure, he had no more time for such conversations. So I told him about my conversation with Kuczynski, and I convinced him to call him back. And so a few days later, he had met with Kuczynski, he had met with Mazowiecki, and he became the head of the government's economic team for the Mazowiecki government. And as for me, I joined that team as his chief economic advisor, because at the time, like you said, I was Director General of the Ministry of Finance, which is nothing like that function today. Today, the General Director in a ministry is an administrative position. So Director General was a title of rank at the time. However, my role back then chiefly consisted in advising Balcerowicz and leading the team of Polish and international advisors who were working with us. So the theft of this spare wheel and the fact that Balcerowicz was not able to drive without it, that is quite symbolic or symptomatic of the state of the Polish economy before the Mazowiecki government came into position. You asked, to what extent did we have to adapt our program to the requirements of the IMF? So, the program of institutional changes that was proposed by the Mazowiecki government and later presented by Balcerowicz in Washington, this program went much further than the IMF could have proposed in 1989 to a country from the former Soviet bloc. So this program went much further. So you could say that the IMF was happy that we were working on this. However, it was a problem to stabilize the economy, and there was hyperinflation for a socialist economy. That was a new phenomenon. Because it is typical of a free market economy without controls. However, both we and the Balcerowicz team and the Ministry of Finance, these people didn't have great experience. So in that regard, we tried to draw on the knowledge and skills of the IMF team. They were very competent. Plus, we had international advisors like Jeffrey Sachs and David Lipton, as well as Polish economists from London, Stanisław Gomułka and Jacek Rostowski. So when creating the program, we had very tough discussions with the IMF and with our advisors, but these discussions didn't stem from the fact that we had some other agenda, and they were due to the fact that the matter we were struggling with was extremely difficult because we were working in conditions of uncertainty and nobody knew how the economy would behave after those solutions were introduced. So the IMF essentially had a task. Their task was to confirm to the Western countries that the programs being introduced in Poland made sense, because the West didn't know what was happening in Poland. So the IMF was supposed to give it a sort of its seal of approval. And so the IMF wanted this program to succeed, and we also wanted this program to succeed, because we knew that a failed program would incur great social costs. We would have to back out of it if it was ill-constructed or for whatever reason. I also remember that in early 1990, I was in the Sejm and I presented a report from talks with the IMF after an agreement had been signed with the IMF. And so after my presentation, the head of this same committee told me that he was shocked by what he'd heard, because he had thought that Poland was in a dramatic situation, that it had debt, it was dependent on its lenders, and would have to do whatever the IMF and the World Bank said. And that's why it had to adopt such a radical program of reforms. Whereas during my presentation, he learned that we introduced that kind of program because that's what we wanted. Maybe let's stay on the topic of Balcerowicz for a little longer. We mentioned his visit to Washington several times when he had talks at the IMF, but he also visited the White House. He spoke to General Scrowcroft, National Security Advisor. Mr. Hutchings, you were at that meeting, if I'm correct, and you also analyzed Balcerowicz's program in 1989. You described it as a program for radical surgery. So what was your approach then? What was your view of Balcerowicz at the time? What was your view of Balcerowicz's cooperation with the IMF? Were you really concerned to secure that agreement? And maybe one more issue. Did you see the program as risky? Did you know that it would incur social pains and might lead to some turmoil in Poland? And finally, what impact did it have on the fact that an international support fund for reforms began to be built with all of the G7 countries involved?
May be very frank, because I've never been accused of being an economist. So in this particular issue, we sort of took a back seat to the Treasury Department and the State Department. Of course, Secretary Baker had just been Secretary of Treasury, as had his advisors, Bob Zellick and others came with him from Treasury, so they were more knowledgeable than we were. We depended sort of at the White House from the advice that we were getting from outside experts, from the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury and their key advisors, who all gave high marks to the credibility and the viability of the plan. And these are people inclined to skepticism about these things. So we met with Jeff Sachs, and I will say one thing about Jeff Sachs. He came under criticism later for his support for the privatization scheme. There's two really separate things. One was the initial plan to transform the Polish economy, which was done, I think, brilliantly. at great political risk. The second was that the longer-term transformation of the Polish economy, this was going to be a messy affair no matter what. This was going to be years in the making. It was going to be politically divisive, as it was everywhere in the post-communist world. But in terms of the initial response to the Balcerowicz and what became known as the Balcerowicz Plan, it was given high marks. And we threw our support behind it thoroughly and developed the stabilization fund of $1 billion to underwrite the program. And these are from practical men like, pardon?
Currency convertibility.
Currency convertibility. And this was supported by practical men like Bush and Baker, who were very careful in their analysis. So we supported a program that we thought was going to work, and we threw our weight entirely behind it because it was a good and a viable plan.
Yeah, I would like Ambassador Simmons to continue this topic. Zostaje pan ambasadorem w 90 roku.
So you became ambassador in 1990, which is a time of transformation, both economic and political one. What challenges did you see when you observed this fledgling democracy and free market economy? Because some issues were seen, because the communists have won, have been defeated, but the solidarity movement started to fall apart, and economic reforms come at a very high cost to society. So what were the challenges for American diplomacy?
I think it's as Bob said, we thought that the program of transformation, political and economic, was sensible, even though it was brave. I mean, our feeling was that success goes to the brave. And the Poles are being brave again. And you had, I was ambassador under 4 different governments. And with every election, threw out the previous government and brought in a new government, and every single government kept to that program. Because I think the solidarity base, they were now voting, the solidarity base was so anti-communist that it continued to support governments that were continuing that program, even though they were suffering. Unemployment went up to 12–14% in a country that had never had any unemployment at all. And I'm optimistic by temperament, so I will throw that in, because I thought that the program was intelligent and brave. As I said before, I never lobbied for Balcerowicz, but every time we had a little agreement to sign, I would call Kozłowski, who was his chief of staff, and say, why don't you call in the press while we sign this agreement? And that would give me a chance to go on national television supporting the program. The crisis came under the Olszewski government in the spring of 1992. In other words, the first parliamentary elections, October 1991, returned 28 parties, I think, to the same. There was a big beer party and there was a small beer party. It was a very divided government, and you had a year of political turmoil. And the Olszewski government came in, and its members, many of them had run against the Balcerowicz program, saying that it was too harsh on the population, and there was a lot of pressure to reflate, to print money in order to ease the pain of the transition. And at a certain point, we got the announcement that Robert Zellick, who was a right-hand man of Secretary Baker now coming from Treasury, was coming to Warsaw. So he arrived, and he went around warning people absolutely quietly, without any publicity at all, that if Poland left the program, there would be quite severe consequences in terms of our relationship with Poland. And that was the last we heard about reflation. So the government continued. You had triple crises. You also had the crisis of the Tečki coming from a special little team of young people going through the secret police files of people in government, and in June sending them over to the Sejm, and Wałęsa cashiering the government. So you had, you put together another solidarity government under Hanna Suchocka, which was in charge for the rest of my time. So it was the Olszewski government that caused the greatest strain, I should think, on the program and on our support. But both of them continued. And by the time I left in April of 1993, the polls were showing, industrial production started up again from the pit into which it had fallen. And the polls, P-O-L-L-S, were showing that 1/3 of the people felt that they were doing better. 1/3 felt that if the program continued, they would do better. And the last third said that they were worse off and they were never going to get better. But I said to myself, if the political problem is whether 2/3 of the people can take care of the 1/3, Poland's actually in pretty good shape. And that's how it turned out.
Jak to wyglądało z polskiej perspektywy?
And from Polish perspective, did you feel the American support? How was it manifested?
Jest tak, że wsparcie amerykańskie było kluczowe.
American support was of key importance in order to make sure that within a couple of weeks we can launch a stabilization program, because Mazowiecki's government came to power in mid-September, and the program was launched on the 1st of January. So in order to launch it so fast, we had to tackle the high inflation. We didn't want it to be rooted in the economy. So the program provided for the introduction of convertibility of Polish zloty, conversion. So in order to meet inflation expectations, the initial exchange rate should be stable, although we had no currency reserves. So this is why we have suggested the founding of a stabilization fund amounting to $1 billion, which would be a security and which would make the exchange rate of Polish zloty credible. So this proposal was independent of the program and the recommendations of IMF, because this was a brand new institution, and we wanted to make sure that it is operationalized by the American Treasury, which has contacted other governments and convinced them to participate in the program and proposed specific organizational solutions. Obviously, at the Ministry of Finance, we have had great relationship with American Department of Treasury and Secretary Nicholas Brady and his deputy, John Robson, or David Malford, who is very efficient as far as indebtedness, Polish debt is concerned, Polish foreign debt is concerned. So when establishing the stabilization fund, the US has played a key role in this process, and a symbolic event presented by my colleagues from the Foreign Department of the Ministry of Finance, when at the end of December the correspondence was exchanged between the members of Stabilization Fund, so the Ministry of Finance in individual countries, in order to make this fund operational as of 1st of January next year. So just before Christmas or New Year, we realized that until the end of the day we need to reach the Ministry of Finance of one of the members of the funds, but we cannot fax them because the fax doesn't answer there. And when our partners at the Department of Treasury found out that we couldn't reach the ministry because they had an ongoing monitoring of the process, so when they realized that we cannot reach them, they contacted American embassy to this country. Then the embassy sent the Marines, who went to the Ministry of Finance, knocked on the door, and asked to immediately turn the fax on, because a very important message will be sent that needs to be received. So the message was successfully received. So this is an example of the American intervention, even American military intervention, to implement our program. So, American military force, another topic that has been touched upon, especially in the opening remarks, Polish membership in NATO. Mr. Ambassador, during your term in office in Warsaw, this topic started to be discussed. So what was your view, or what was the American view on this issue? The Poles wanted to join NATO. Americans probably wanted Poland in NATO, but the two parts saw the speed of the accession differently, I believe.
I think it's an exaggeration to say that the Americans wanted Poland in NATO at this early point. My view, and it was also the view of Washington, was that expansion eastward of NATO was premature at this point. There were people in the government. Jerzy Milewski was the old trade union activist who had been made head of this new National Security Council under the Prime Minister. And he was an advocate for rapid raising the issue of entry into NATO. But as far as my government was concerned, they were still worried about the Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991, and therefore became much less of a threat. And so the third crisis in relations was during once again, the Olszewski government, which wanted not only to reflate and was breaking the Gruba-Kreska policy by fooling around with secret police files and sending them to Parliament, but also was determined to raise NATO entry when Olszewski visited Washington in the spring of 1991. And I thought that it would simply not be understood by the President and by Secretary of Defense Cheney to have the Polish Prime Minister come in and highlight the issue of NATO enlargement or Polish entry into NATO, which we thought would be premature. So I advocated against raising the issue. And more importantly, so did Jan Nowak Jaruzelski. So we had a little tag team wrestling match with Olszewski and especially with Zdzisław Najdę, who was his national security advisor. And it came to almost a shouting match in the Polish embassy in Washington on the night before they were going to meet with the President and Secretary Cheney. And in the end, they gave up. Najdę never forgave me. In his memoir, he was really scathing about the incident, but I think it was the right thing. I think it was the right thing because I think it really took the Żyrynowski election in late 1993 to frighten the U.S. government into a different view of Russia as a security threat, and therefore in early 1994 to endorse NATO expansion, beginning with Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary at that point. So that was the triple crisis of the Olszewski government. I noticed numbers of them have turned up in the peace government, which left office last October.
Pan ambasador właśnie wspomniał, że wydarzenia
You just mentioned that the events in Poland set in motion a wave of revolutions across Central and Eastern Europe. Poland was first in 1989, both when it comes to elections, the political shift in politics and the economy, and Poland was at the center of the White House's attention. Is it not that it later faded into the background after the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunited? So after 1989, what is the role of Poland? And how does it develop in the context of German reunification, but also the Gulf War?
Let me back up a little bit and pick up where Tom Simons left off. I don't think the attitude toward Poland's eventually joining NATO was fully developed in our government yet. I was certainly in favor of it, and I was advocating for it. I thought that a NATO that did not include Central Europe in this new context made no sense. I was actually later on opposed to the subsequent expansion into the Baltic states and into southeastern Europe, which I thought added a bunch of new countries that didn't bring much in the way of assets into NATO and created new risks for the alliance. But as far as Poland, Hungary, and the then Czechoslovakia, I thought it was essential that they came in. This became tangible in President Bush's last visit as president in the summer of 1992. We had drafted at the NSC, together with key people at the Pentagon and the State Department, a paragraph for inclusion in the president's speech in Castle Square, holding out the prospect in carefully worded language about Poland's joining Western institutions, the European Community, European Union, and NATO. Not a promise of membership, but the expectation that this was where things were going. It was approved all the way up to the level of Bush and Baker, and Scowcroft, and they ultimately decided not to use the paragraph. I drafted it. I wish I'd kept it. It's lost to the ether now. And I think I understand their reasoning. Their reasoning was the last Soviet troops had not yet been withdrawn from the region. To raise this issue now, just for rhetorical purposes or to reassure the Poles, was just too risky. It could risk undermining a lot. Remember, the anti-Gorbachev coup was just about to occur, and we could see those things developing. But I think our assumption was that these three countries, at least in Central Europe, would and should and must really become NATO members down the road. But it had to await the next administration to pick it up. The way you phrased the question of how Poland didn't have quite the centrality of purpose, I would actually flip it on its head. That we had this unusual period in 1989 and 1990 when Poland was at the center of American policy. It was the driving force behind a lot. We had, and for me as the East Europeanist and Germanist on the NSC staff, this was the most wonderful thing I could have imagined. My region had the top priority of the President of the United States and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. So we had this unusual period, and I think it was fortuitous that we had this concentration of political attention on this pivotal issue at the right time. Then, as events that no one really foresaw, the speed with which German unification took place, and then the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, inevitably distracted the attention, commanded the attention of the United States going forward. But in those early days, we had this unusual period in which we had undivided attention. I will say there's one issue that you haven't touched on yet, and that is in the process of German unification, which also has a whole lot to do with Polish security and Polish well-being. We paid a lot of attention to the question of the Polish-German border, because I had lived in Bavaria for 5 years. There are still German expellees from Poland living in Bavaria who, I don't know what they're doing, maybe doing needlepoint swastikas at home at night, who harbored sort of visions of recovering lost territory. We wanted to put this issue to bed. It was an issue that was not well understood by the American public, but as I wrote it in memos to the President, no border in East Central Europe predates 1918. If we start revisiting borders, you know, there's no stopping where this goes. So we wanted, in the course of German unification, we demanded in the course of German unification that the border, the Polish-German border be finally determined, that where it is where it stays. So we lobbied hard for that. Did I miss one of the questions you posed? I will say that, yeah, inevitably, attention began to wander, and I certainly noticed it as the cognizant person in the NSE staff with responsibility for East Central Europe, that it no longer commanded the attention that it once did. Inevitably, the Iraq War, you know, sending 500,000 American forces or coalition forces to the Gulf does have a way of focusing the attention of the President, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense. So inevitably, attention wandered a little bit.
Just one word on George H.W. Bush. That visit in July of 1992, once again, I think there was an electoral element. The Polish-American vote was an element in that, but mainly it was a celebration. And that included a celebration, I think, of the President's role in our policy vis-a-vis Poland. I went on the radio to invite people to Castle Square, and Wałęsa later said that George Bush had the biggest crowd of anyone in Castle Square except for the Pope.
No właśnie, bo dzisiaj spotkaliśmy
Exactly,
się, żeby rozmawiać
because today we're meeting to talk and to celebrate 2 anniversary. anniversaries, the 35th anniversary of the 1989 elections, but also in June we have the 100th anniversary of the birth of George Bush, President Bush, and referring to the Pope. Lech Wałęsa once said that he had calculated the mathematical formula for his share and the share of the American administration and John Paul II in bringing down communism. I don't remember what percentages he calculated. It's not important at any rate. However, we still have 10 minutes. And could each of you briefly present your percentage estimations, i.e., to what extent did American policy towards Poland have a share in bringing about Poland's political transition and its success in that particular form? So maybe percentage-wise, how much do Poles owe to themselves? How much do they owe to the international community or international factors? Let's start with Mr. Hutchins.
Percentages, but I think there's plenty of credit to go around, and I wouldn't put the United States in first place. I think we have to be a little more modest about our role there. I think Gorbachev deserves a lot of credit. More inadvertently than purposefully, he opened up things that he never imagined would take place. But without the opening that he made, I don't think the events of '89 would have occurred for another many years, several years at least. I think communism was doomed in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, eventually, but Gorbachev hastened the process, I think, unwittingly. Certainly the Poles deserve a great deal of credit for their skill in managing this process. I know Poles have a sort of self-image of being heroic and maybe a little reckless, but actually Poles are pretty logical and careful and restrained during this period of managing their way through this period with considerable discipline, which helped things come out successfully. The U.S. role, I think, was indispensable, but secondary. In galvanizing the Western alliance, most of our West European allies were not ready for changes of this magnitude, didn't see them coming as fast as we did. As I mentioned earlier, in the very early part of the year, we saw this logical progression that if the terms of the Roundtable Agreement are observed, this is the beginning of the end of communism, not only in Poland, but everywhere in Eastern Europe, meaning German unification has just come onto the agenda. We started talking about Germany already in the spring of '89, 6 months before the opening of the Berlin Wall. I don't think our West European allies saw it coming this fast. So I think the United States, you know, I guess I'm guilty of a little triumphalism here. I don't see how we could have done any better, frankly. And I've been very critical of U.S. policy and other things. If you read what I've written about the time I was chairman of the National Intelligence Council during the Iraq War, I'm extremely critical of U.S. policy. I'm not always an apologist, but I think in this period we got it right, thanks to the good advice of people like Ambassador Simons and many others, thanks to the partnership we had developed with the Poles, especially Polish opposition over decades. The kind of trusting relationship you don't achieve overnight. It's sort of an argument for diplomacy, even in the darkest times, because we had this sort of mutual understanding and trust that doesn't come easily between countries. So I think the United States role was indispensable, but I would give pride of place to the Poles and grudging respect to Gorbachev, who inadvertently opened the floodgates.
Ja uważam, że
So I believe that American policy was of key significance at the origin. And what do I mean by that? I remember a meeting with Ludwig Dorn who was an oppositionist during martial law. Both of us were in hiding at the time. And this was a period when American missiles were dislocated across Western Europe in response to the deployment of missiles in the Soviet Union and across the East. The Soviet Union was including its organizations and satellites, was protesting against the deployment of American weapons in Europe. So Dorn said that the deployment of those weapons could have a decisive influence. And in my view, it did, because deploying those missiles, and they were more technologically advanced than the Russian weapons. And that made it clear to the Soviet military complex that they had lost the arms race against the US. And hence the later consent to reforms as seen in the choice in the election of Gorbachev a few years down the road. So it was then that Reagan's decision to deploy those missiles and to resist had been validated, which wasn't obvious before. But later on, the American actions in 1989 in response to what was happening in the Soviet Union, because there were changes in the Soviet Union which impacted what was happening in Poland, Jaruzelski's decisions and so on. So those changes, like Mr. Hutchins said, America acted, they rose to the occasion, but they were also using the occasion, seizing the chance. The states were not incurring risks. They were acting cautiously, intelligently. The aid to Poland had great significance for Poland from the financial standpoint. Poland was such a small economy. From the standpoint of the states, it had no real economic impact. However, it did have incredible impact, political impact. And so the Americans used the chance that arose, but also, importantly, Poland equally used the opportunity. We would not have created the opportunity by ourselves, but I think we used it to its full potential. And here, both the solidarity elites rose to the challenge. The elites created within solidarity and the opposition. Another important thing was the engagement of these prominent Poles in America. So Nawrocki and Brzezinski. And all of it together meant that the opportunity was well used in 1989 and 1990.
As for the forecast, there is an anecdote about the visit of German delegations in November 1989. So we had a big visit from Germany headed by Chancellor Karol. At that point, Wałęsa was the head of the Solidarity Trade Union, so he met with Wałęsa in Warsaw, and during the meeting, Wałęsa said, well, I know you Germans think about reunification, and the Karol said, no, it's just a matter of time. And Wałęsa said, to me, it could happen even tomorrow. And it did. The Berlin Wall fell. The next day, the German delegation stopped its visits and came back to Germany for 2 days to react to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then they returned to Poland to continue the visit. Thank you.
add a slight note here just to bring things up to some of the current debates, because there's a current of view among some academics, none in this room, but back in the United States, that the United States made mistakes with the Soviet Union back in this day, Soviet Union and Russia back in this day, and we're responsible for this revanchist Russia we see today. I think this is a kind of the fallacy of believing that the Poles, the Americans, and others could have achieved everything we did and also have satisfied Moscow. I think that's an impossible combination, because what would have been required to satisfy Moscow and to avert the kind of reaction we see now from Moscow would have been no Polish membership in NATO, a kind of droit de regard of Moscow in this region, even after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and so on. So I think there's a kind of a current of opinion that we could have had it all. We could have avoided antagonizing the Soviet Union and still gotten all the rest of these benefits. I think that's just a mistaken understanding of history. I think we did what we could, and Soviet and Russian attitudes are what they are. They would have been that way regardless.
Panie ambasadorze, do pana należy...
Mr. Ambassador, it is up to you to sum up and to close our discussion. So please, if you could.
I basically agree with the analysis of my colleagues here. I'd add a couple of elements. I think the Poles were responsible for 2/3 or 4/5 of the transformation. And I think the outside external elements, including us, have another third or a quarter. I would add the Pope to the Polish part, because I think he played an important role in supporting solidarity, in keeping solidarity managed under martial law, where it lost a lot of membership, but it managed to keep its organization and its ethos and its ability to set policy intact. And I think the Pope had something to do with that. I would add that not only did we develop good relations with solidarity, I can remember on one of the Whitehead visits in the American ambassador's residence, in came Adam Michnik with an armful of pamphlets that the U.S. had paid for and bought the printing machinery for via the AFL-CIO, our major trade union federation. And he came in with this armful of pamphlets to show Whitehead that not all of our money had been wasted. So, but we also kept relations with the government, even though we disapproved of the government. And so I think we had relations with both sides, which were useful as the transformation got underway. I can remember one Whitehead visit where Jaruzelski looked over at John Davis, who was the chargé still at the time, and said, "My zjedliśmy razem beczkę soli."
We have been through a lot together.
We've eaten a barrel of salt together, which is a peasant saying, and it was true, and I think that helped also. But I think the outcome, I think, validates one of the oldest Polish revolutionary slogans, "Za waszą I naszą wolność." And I think we achieved something of that together.
Za naszą I waszą wolność.
To our and yours freedom, za waszą I naszą wolność. This is a great conclusion to our panel. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, a great pleasure to moderate this discussion.
Właściwie prawie o czasie.
We have finished almost on time. In 15 minutes we'll start the next panel, which will be a discussion of the academics who will focus on the years 1988 until 89, and then we'll, after the papers are read, we'll have a discussion during which you could relate to what has been said, and you can comment on the papers, which I strongly advise. Thank you. And now it's time for a coffee break.